billions of dollars of lost gold, a World War I ghost ship, and a submarine that disappeared in the Bermuda Triangle. Finding any one of these shipwrecks could rewrite history, but to this day, they're still lost to time. Every schoolchild in the US knows the three ships that carried Christopher Columbus to the Americas: the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Yet, familiar as those names may be, we don't actually know much about what happened to them. And of course, those weren't really the names of the ships, but that's for another video. Anyway, the Niña and the Pinta eventually returned to Europe, but the Santa Maria, once the flagship of the three, was wrecked on a reef near Haiti on December 24, 1492. Now, the timbers were reportedly salvaged to construct a nearby settlement, but upon Christopher Columbus's return to the area in 1493, it had burned down and any crew members left behind had either died or left. Nothing of the Santa Maria-derived settlement has definitively been found, nor have searches along the reef uncovered the remains of a 15th century ship that would fit the bill. In 2014, a marine archaeologist named Barry Clifford did claim to have uncovered the wreck.
How sure are you that this is the Santa Maria?
I'm extremely confident.
But a UNESCO team concluded that what Clifford had found came from a much later shipwreck, meaning that the search for the Santa Maria continues. While much has been made of the Titanic, there are other major ocean liner disasters that deserve at least as much attention. And while the wreck of the Titanic was finally discovered, the 20th century cruise liner SS Waratah was not only dramatically lost, but remains unfound. The Waratah was a large, luxurious British liner meant to travel between Europe and Australia. It left London on its first voyage in 1908, stopping off in Cape Town, South Africa, before heading to Adelaide, Australia, and then making a safe return to London in early 1909. The second voyage was less uneventful. In June 1909, so 3 years before the Titanic, the Waratah docked in Australia. There, it loaded up with cargo that included 880 tons of lead and 7,800 bars of metal bullion, along with 215 passengers and 119 crew. It made it to Durban, South Africa, where engineer Claude Sawyer disembarked after noticing the alarming way the ship rolled in the waves. Sawyer was grimly correct. The Waratah left Durban and, apart from a sighting by a passing ship, was never seen again. Several theories for the disappearance focused on possible structural flaws in the ship, an overloaded cargo hold, bad weather, and even an explosion. But despite intense efforts to recover the wreck, nothing's come up. Even a champion of the effort, filmmaker Emlyn Brown, concluded in 2004 that the search for the Waratah had hit a wall. So when you think about lost shipwrecks, you usually picture them lying under the vast waters of our planet's oceans. But there are also mysteries hidden in some relatively smaller bodies of water, like Lake Michigan. The deepest point in the Great Lakes, and Lake Superior, lies some 1,332 feet below the surface. It's no wonder then that the Great Lakes still hide some of the most mysterious shipwrecks in history. One of the most famous may be Lake Griffon, which sank somewhere in northern Lake Michigan in 1679. Led by René Robert Cavelier Sieur de la Salle, the ship set off on an arduous voyage across the Great Lakes, often needing to be hauled by hand between the lakes, to the northern coast of Lake Michigan. The goal was to collect furs for trading, and in September 1679, La Salle sent Le Griffon ahead to begin the return journey to sell their wares. But as autumn came, it became clear that Le Griffon had vanished. Was it mutiny? A storm? To this day, no clear evidence for the ship's fate has been found, including its wreck.
Probably the most sought-after shipwreck in the Great Lakes. It's quite literally the holy grail, if you will, of shipwrecks.
There have been multiple false positives over the years, most recently in 2024 when two divers told the Detroit Free Press that they believed that they had found what remained of Le Griffon near a small island south of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. But others were vocally skeptical, saying that the underwater footage shows a 19th century wreck. To them, the search for Le Griffon remains ongoing. The 16th century Flor de la Mar was the pride of Portugal, at least it was in the beginning. After Portugal took the rich port of Malacca, now part of southwest Malaysia, and loaded the Flor de la Mar with treasure, things went wrong. Departing Malacca in November 1511, the ship skirted Sumatra and encountered a tempest so fierce that the Flor de la Mar broke apart. The treasure sank to the bottom of the ocean and some 400 sailors died. Naturally, the wreck of the Flor de la Mar has attracted many treasure hunters in the intervening centuries. The ship reportedly contained a staggering 80 tons of gold, along with chests full of jewels and coins that would make any pirate swoon with joy, only no one's been able to find it. Perhaps it was quietly looted by locals, or just possibly it's still out there waiting to be found. The disappearance of the Andrea Gail was certainly a tragedy, although only a local one at first. And it probably would have remained that way if not for an aspiring freelance writer named Sebastian Junger, who lived in the ship's home port of Gloucester, Massachusetts. Junger first published a story in Outside magazine in 1994 that detailed the disappearance of the Andrea Gail. That story became a nonfiction book, The Perfect Storm, which sold over 5 million copies and inspired the 2000 film of the same name.
Billy, these storms have collided! They are exploding!
Andrea Gail encountered a massive storm somewhere off the coast of Newfoundland, and presumably sank with her crew of 6 on October 29, 1991. A brief conversation between the Andrea Gail's captain Billy Tyne and fellow fishing boat captain Linda Greenlaw referenced the lousy weather, but was otherwise unremarkable. After that, the ship disappeared, with no radio communications indicating trouble. When it became clear that something had gone wrong, the U.S. Coast Guard began searching, but the efforts were called off after 10 days. The next month, the ship's emergency beacon washed ashore, but nothing else of the ship has ever been recovered. And although millions of people became familiar with the story through Junger's book and the film, the real-life wreck of the Andrea Gail has never been found. Finding it may or may not provide much new evidence about that fateful October night, but it would surely bring some closure to the families of the 6 men who were on board. Look, we all know that oceans are some pretty big places, but nothing really hammers home the vastness of the seas like the US Navy losing one of its biggest ships. How big? In 1918, the USS Cyclops was one of the largest in the entire fleet, coming in at 540 feet long and 65 feet wide. Originally, it was a civilian vessel meant to transport coal, but it was pressed into military service once the US entered World War I in 1917. On its last voyage, the Cyclops traveled to Rio de Janeiro to drop off nearly 10,000 tons of coal and returned to Baltimore with 11,000 tons of manganese, needed for the steel industry, a key component to the ongoing war effort. On the way back home, the Cyclops took an unexpected resupply stop in Barbados, but after leaving port in Barbados, the ship never reappeared. More than 300 sailors were aboard, yet no communications beyond a terse "weather fair, all well" were received. Finding the wreck, presumably somewhere in the Atlantic between Maryland and Barbados, would likely provide some answers. But despite the efforts of explorers and some of the crew members' descendants, no trace of the lost Cyclops has ever been found. During World War I, there was an increased demand for ships of war, including minesweepers meant to search out and neutralize enemy explosives. Their manufacturing partner for the French Navy was the Canadian Car and Foundry Company, which built 12 minesweepers for France during the course of the war. Manufactured in Thunder Bay, Ontario, the ships were sent in small groups through Lake Superior, moving via canals and the other Great Lakes to the Atlantic. The final 3 included the Sebastopol, Inkerman, and Cerisoles, which left in November 1918. While they were midway across Lake Superior, the trio encountered a fierce storm. The ships lost sight of one another, and while the Sebastopol made it to safety, neither the Inkerman nor the Cerisoles was ever seen again. The Sebastopol's crew assumed the other 2 had simply gotten ahead and that they'd rendezvous at the next port, which meant it took days before anyone realized something was wrong. Despite a large search, the missing ships were never found.
It's as if those vessels just vanished off the face of the earth. Why have these 2 ships been so hard to find?
There are tales of the sunken minesweepers that have surfaced occasionally, including one eerie legend of human remains sporting a French Navy uniform found on a Lake Superior shore in 1919. Certainly something of the Inkerman and Cerisoles remained in the depths of Lake Superior, though whether or not someone will find the wreckage and answer lingering questions about the ships remains to be seen. High-tech expeditions using side-scan sonar haven't yet found the minesweepers, though it's possible that one day they'll turn up. The Baychimo story began in 1914 when the cargo steamer left the shipbuilding yards of Gothenburg, Sweden for its new home in Germany. It was turned over to Britain after World War I, and by 1920 it had been sold to the Hudson's Bay Company. It began operating on the icy western shores of Canada and Alaska. It was a harsh environment by any stretch, where ships were often at risk of getting caught in the ice. Her luck ran out in 1931 when a September storm battered the already worn ship. By October, the Baychimo was locked in ice. Most of the crew left via aircraft, while some set up camp nearby to keep an eye on the ship and its cargo. But one morning after a blizzard, they emerged to see that the Baychimo had disappeared. It didn't sink though, it stayed afloat and occasionally reappeared. She was spotted over a dozen times over the years, the last time in 1969, that's 38 years later. After that, the Baychimo was presumed to have finally sunk beneath the waves. Either that or it's still out there, a mysterious ghost ship sailing the frozen seas. Among the submarines put into service during World War II, few were more astonishing than the French Surcouf. Built in the late 1920s, it was 361 feet long, weighed in at 2,880 tons, and carried a crew of 150. This included some serious artillery, including 2 8-inch guns and 14 torpedo tubes, as well as a seaplane. The Surcouf spent much of its time during World War II escorting Allied craft in the Atlantic and Pacific. However, in early 1942, something went wrong. Leaving Nova Scotia for Tahiti, the Surcouf was meant to cross into the Pacific via the Panama Canal. It never made it, and nobody ever saw it again. So what happened? One likely possibility is that the Surcouf was struck by a friendly vessel. The evening of February 18th, the American freighter Thomson Lykes was in the area, and the crew reported that they had struck something partially submerged. Whether that something really was the Surcouf remains a mystery. Finding the wreck of this long-lost submarine could potentially answer the question of its wartime end and at least bring some closure to family members of the lost crew.